The open road stretched before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast American landscape. My loyal companion, a scruffy mutt with soulful eyes, sat contentedly in the passenger seat, his head hanging out the window as we cruised along. We were on a cross-country adventure, just the two of us, with Yellowstone National Park as our next destination. As we approached the park, my excitement grew. I had heard so much about its natural wonders, the geysers, hot springs, and diverse wildlife. The plan was simple: find a campsite, set up for the night, and spend the next few days exploring this magnificent wilderness. The sun was already dipping low on the horizon when we finally reached the park entrance. After paying the entry fee and receiving a map from the ranger, I drove towards the first campground on my list. To my dismay, a large full sign greeted me at the entrance. No problem, I thought, there are plenty of other campgrounds in the park. Little did I know that this was just the beginning of a long and frustrating search. As I drove from one campground to another, the story remained the same: every single site was occupied. The park was teeming with visitors, all eager to experience the beauty of Yellowstone during the peak season. I circled the park's main loop road multiple times, hoping that someone might have left early or that a last-minute cancellation would open up a spot. With each passing minute, the sun sank lower, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink. Under different circumstances, I would have marveled at the breathtaking sunset, but my growing concern about finding a place to sleep overshadowed its beauty. As darkness settled over the park, I realized I had to make a decision. The idea of sleeping in my car in a parking lot didn't appeal to me, especially with my furry friend in tow. That's why I remembered passing a secluded trailhead earlier. It wasn't an official campsite, but it seemed like the best option given the circumstances. With a mix of trepidation and determination, I steered my vehicle back to the trailhead. The parking lot was empty, which was both a relief and slightly unnerving. I quickly gathered my gear, strapping my frame pack to my back and ensuring I had all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a few basic tools. My dog seemed to sense the change in plans, wagging his tail excitedly as we set off down the trail. The path was barely visible in the fading light, but I had a good flashlight to guide our way. We hiked for about 15 minutes, moving deeper into the wilderness, before I decided we had gone far enough to avoid detection. Veering off the trail, we made our way to the edge of a small clearing. It was a picturesque spot, with a grassy meadow surrounded by towering pines. In the distance, I could make out the silhouette of mountains against the star-studded sky. Despite the unplanned nature of our campsite, I couldn't help but feel a sense of adventure and connection with nature. Knowing the importance of minimizing our impact on the environment, I carefully selected a spot for our camp. I chose a flat area with minimal vegetation, hoping to leave as little trace as possible of our presence. My first task was to dig a small fire pit. Using a collapsible shovel from my pack, I scraped away the top layer of soil and created a circular depression. Next came the tent. I had practiced setting it up in my backyard before the trip, and that practice paid off now as I efficiently assembled our shelter for the night. My dog watched curiously, occasionally sniffing around the perimeter of our makeshift campsite. With the tent up, I turned my attention to dinner. I had packed some hot dogs, thinking they'd be an easy meal to cook over a campfire. As I gathered some small branches and kindling for the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruders in this wild place. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me pause and look around, half expecting to see a park ranger or wild animal emerging from the darkness. Once the fire was going, I roasted the hot dogs on long sticks. My canine companion sat patiently, his eyes fixed on the sizzling meat. The aroma of cooking food filled the air, and I hoped it wouldn't attract any unwanted visitors. We shared our simple meal, the hot dogs tasting better than any gourmet dish in that moment of hunger and exhaustion. After dinner, I meticulously cleaned up our site. I knew the importance of proper food storage in bear country, so I gathered all our leftovers and trash into a bag. Using some rope from my pack, I hung the bag high in a nearby tree, well away from our tent. It was a bit of a struggle in the dark, but I knew it was crucial for our safety. With everything secured, I extinguished the fire, making sure to douse it thoroughly with water from my canteen. I scattered the wood ashes and covered the fire pit with the soil I had initially removed, trying to erase any evidence of our presence. Exhausted from the long day of driving and the unexpected hike, I crawled into the tent with my dog. The lightweight sleeping bag provided welcome warmth against the cool night air. As I lay there, listening to the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl, I felt a mix of emotions: excitement at the adventure, a twinge of guilt for camping in an unauthorized area, and a hint of apprehension about what the night might bring. Sleep came quickly, but it was destined to be a night of interruptions. I'm not sure how long I had been asleep when the first howl pierced the night. At first, it sounded distant, maybe a few miles away. In my groggy state, I marveled at the haunting beauty of the sound. It was a reminder that we were in true wilderness, sharing the land with its wild inhabitants. As I started to drift back to sleep, another howl rang out, this time noticeably closer. My dog, who had been sleeping soundly at my feet, raised his head, ears perked in alert curiosity. I patted him reassuringly, trying to convey a calmness I didn't entirely feel. The howls continued, each time seeming to come from a different direction and growing ever closer. It was hard to judge distance in the dark, unfamiliar terrain, but I estimated that the wolves were now at the edge of the meadow where we were camped. My mind raced, trying to recall everything I knew about wolf behavior. I knew attacks on humans were extremely rare, but that did little to calm my racing heart. Soon, the sounds of padding feet and sniffing noses circled our tent. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. My dog, to his credit, remained silent, though I could feel him trembling slightly against my leg. The wolves seemed curious, investigating this strange new object in their territory. Those minutes felt like hours as we waited, hoping the wolves would lose interest and move on. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the sounds began to recede. A distant howl signaled that the pack was moving away, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. As the adrenaline subsided, exhaustion took over once more, and I drifted back to sleep. The next time I awoke, the sky outside was still dark, but I had the sense that several hours had passed. This time, however, the sounds that roused me were very different. Heavy footfalls circled the tent, accompanied by deep, huffing breaths. My first thought was bear, and a jolt of fear shot through me. While wolves were unlikely to attack, a hungry or curious bear could easily see our tent as something to investigate more thoroughly. The unseen visitor seemed particularly interested in the spot where I had buried the fire pit. I silently cursed myself for not being more thorough in cleaning up. Even the faintest scent of food could attract a bear's keen nose. After nosing around the fire pit area, the bear turned its attention to our tent. Each lumbering step it took sent vibrations through the ground, emphasizing its massive size. As it circled closer, I knew I had to do something to deter it without provoking an attack. With trembling hands, I reached for my flashlight. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I flicked it on, illuminating the tent from within. The sudden appearance of the glowing dome seemed to startle the bear. I heard a surprised huff, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps. Even after the sounds of the bear faded away, sleep eluded me. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig brought me to full alert. As the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, I finally felt it was safe enough to peer outside. Unzipping the tent cautiously, I stuck my head out and surveyed our surroundings. The meadow was peaceful in the early morning light, with no sign of our nighttime visitors. A light rain had begun to fall, adding a misty quality to the scene that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Knowing we needed to leave quickly, I began packing up our campsite. The rain made everything damp, adding to the challenge of breaking camp. My dog seemed eager to be on the move, perhaps still unsettled by the night's events. We hiked back to the trailhead in record time, my pace quickened by the desire to return to the relative safety of populated areas. As we drove away from the parking lot, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering excitement from our wilderness encounter. Luck was finally on our side as we found a campground with a vacancy that morning. As I was setting up my damp tent to dry, a park ranger approached, clipboard in hand. He asked about my previous night's accommodation, mentioning they had a record of my entry but no registered campsite. In a moment of panic, I lied, claiming I had slept in my truck in a parking lot. The rangers seemed skeptical but didn't press the issue, simply reminding me of the park's camping regulations and moving on. I felt a twinge of guilt for the deception but was relieved to avoid any potential fines or reprimands. The rest of our time in Yellowstone was, thankfully, far less eventful. We spent our days exploring the park's famous attractions, watching Old Faithful erupt, marveling at the colorful hot springs, and observing herds of bison from a safe distance. Each night, I made sure we were safely checked into an official campsite well before dark. As our time in the park came to an end, we hit the road again, heading west towards Portland, Oregon. The journey took us through changing landscapes from the rugged mountains of Idaho to the high desert of eastern Oregon and finally into the lush greenery of the Pacific Northwest. We took our time, stopping at various campsites along the way. Each night, as I set up our tent in designated camping areas, I couldn't help but reflect on our Yellowstone adventure. While it had been frightening at times, it had also given me a profound respect for the wild places and creatures we share this planet with. Arriving in Portland felt like the end of an epic journey. The city's quirky charm and abundant green spaces were a welcoming sight after so many days on the road. We spent a week exploring the city and its surroundings, hiking in the Columbia River Gorge and along the Oregon coast. As I sat in a Portland coffee shop on our last day, planning the next leg of our journey, I couldn't help but smile at the memory of that night in Yellowstone. It had been unplanned, uncomfortable, and at times terrifying, but it was also an experience I would never forget. It had taught me about my own resilience, the unpredictability of nature, and the importance of respecting wildlife and wilderness areas. That night in Yellowstone, while not the comfortable camping experience I had initially planned, had become the defining moment of our cross-country adventure. It was a reminder that sometimes the most memorable experiences come from the unexpected turns in our journey, and that nature, in all its beauty and wildness, deserves our respect and admiration. As we prepared to leave Portland and continue our journey, I felt a renewed sense of excitement for the road ahead. Whatever challenges or adventures awaited us, I knew we were ready to face them, my loyal dog and I, two travelers making our way across this vast and beautiful country. It was a warm summer evening in 2017 when I found myself driving through the winding roads of rural Virginia. My car, a weathered sedan that had become my home in recent months, rumbled along the pavement as I searched for a place to rest for the night. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the countryside and painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. As I navigated the unfamiliar terrain, my eyes caught sight of a sign indicating a campground ahead. Feeling the weight of exhaustion from hours of driving, I decided to pull in and find a spot to settle for the night. The campground was expansive, with numerous clearings nestled among the trees. To my relief, it appeared mostly empty, save for a large group gathered in a distant corner of the grounds. I chose a spot far from the group, hoping for a quiet night's rest. As I began to set up my modest camp, really just a hammock strung between two sturdy trees, I couldn't help but notice the boisterous sounds emanating from the other campers. Their laughter and chatter carried on the evening breeze, punctuated occasionally by the barking of dogs. Despite the noise, I tried to focus on my own tasks. I unpacked a small cooler with my meager supplies and prepared a simple dinner of canned beans and crackers. As I ate, I watched the sky darken and stars begin to twinkle overhead. The air grew cooler, and I pulled on a worn sweatshirt to ward off the chill. Throughout the evening, a few dogs from the other group wandered over to investigate my campsite. They seemed friendly enough, sniffing around curiously before returning to their owners. I found their presence somewhat comforting, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone in this unfamiliar place. As night fully settled in, I retreated to my hammock, looking forward to a peaceful sleep beneath the canopy of trees. The sounds from the other group had quieted somewhat, and I hoped they were settling in for the night as well. I lay there, gently swaying in the breeze, listening to the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, a commotion from across the campground jolted me awake. Voices rose in volume, and there was a sense of anticipation in the air. Curiosity got the better of me, and I sat up in my hammock, straining my eyes to see what was happening in the distance. What I witnessed next sent a chill down my spine. In the dim light of the camp, I could make out the silhouette of a woman leading a small child towards a large wooden structure. As they drew closer, I realized with growing horror that the structure was a cross, standing ominously against the night sky. My heart raced as I watched the woman gently guide the child's hand, helping them light the cross ablaze. The flames licked upwards, casting an eerie glow across the campground and illuminating the faces of those gathered around. It was then that the true nature of this group became horrifyingly clear. The burning cross stood as a symbol of hatred and intolerance, a rallying point for the Ku Klux Klan members who had gathered here in secret. As the fire grew, so did the fervor of the group. Voices rose in a cacophony of hatred, shouting slogans and chants that made my blood run cold. "White power," they cried, their voices filled with a misguided passion that I couldn't comprehend. The speeches that followed were filled with vitriol, each word dripping with prejudice and ignorance. They spoke of purification, of cleansing the country of those they deemed unworthy. Their rhetoric was a poisonous mix of fear, anger, and misguided superiority. As I lay there, frozen in my hammock, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding before me. The faces illuminated by the burning cross ranged from young to old, men and women alike caught up in this tide of hatred. But it was the children present that truly broke my heart. Innocent faces looked on with a mixture of confusion and awe, absorbing the toxic ideology being presented to them as truth. The ceremony continued late into the night, with various members taking turns to speak. Their words blurred together in a haze of bigotry and intolerance, each speech more inflammatory than the last. I found myself torn between the desire to flee and the paralysis of shock and disbelief. As the night wore on, exhaustion finally overcame my fear, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. My dreams were haunted by the images I had witnessed: the burning cross, the chanting crowd, and most of all, the innocent child being inducted into this world of hate. When dawn broke, I wasted no time in packing up my meager belongings and leaving the campground. As I drove away, the events of the night replayed in my mind. The contrast between the beautiful, peaceful Virginia countryside and the ugliness I had witnessed was stark and unsettling. In the years that followed, I often found myself reflecting on that night. The memory of the child being gently guided to light the cross became a powerful symbol to me of how hatred is passed down through generations. It was a stark reminder of the work still needed to combat prejudice and promote understanding in our society. That experience in rural Virginia became a turning point in my life. It sparked a determination in me to work towards a more inclusive and tolerant world, to challenge bigotry wherever I encountered it, and to strive to be a force for positive change. The innocence of that child, juxtaposed against the backdrop of such hatred, continues to motivate me to this day. As I continue on my journey through life, I carry with me the weight of that night's events. It serves as a constant reminder of the darkness that can exist in the world, but also the importance of standing up for what is right. In sharing this story, I hope to shed light on the ongoing struggle against hatred and prejudice, and to inspire others to join in the fight for a more just and equitable society. 2 summers ago, I embarked on what was supposed to be a peaceful 8-mile backpacking trip into the remote wilderness surrounding Mount Hood, Oregon, with my girlfriend. Little did we know that this adventure would become etched in our memories as one of the most terrifying experiences of our lives. As we trekked through the rugged terrain, the pristine beauty of the Pacific Northwest surrounded us. The air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine, and the sound of our footsteps on the trail was accompanied by the occasional chirping of birds. After several hours of hiking, we finally reached our destination, a serene lake nestled in a valley, surrounded by a forest of dead trees. The sight of the dead forest was both eerie and captivating. The skeletal remains of once majestic trees stood like silent sentinels around the lake, their bare branches reaching towards the sky. We chose a spot to set up camp, carefully considering our surroundings. As we worked on pitching our tent, I noticed another tent across the lake. It was the only other sign of human presence in this remote area, but strangely, we never saw anyone at that site. As we settled into our campsite, the sky began to change. Dark clouds started rolling in from the distant hills, and a sense of unease crept over us. We had checked the weather forecast before our trip, and thunderstorms were uncommon in this region, especially during this time of year. Nevertheless, we decided to prepare for the worst. We worked quickly to secure our tent, driving the stakes deep into the ground and double-checking all the guy lines. I dug a small trench around the perimeter of our tent to divert any potential rainwater. All the while, we kept glancing nervously at the dead trees surrounding us. Their dry, brittle branches looked like they could snap at any moment in strong winds. As we finished our preparations, the wind began to pick up, whistling through the bare branches of the dead forest. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the atmosphere grew heavy with the promise of rain. We gathered our belongings and huddled inside our tent, hoping it would provide adequate shelter from the impending storm. The rain started as a light patter on the tent fabric but quickly intensified into a torrential downpour. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by the ominous rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. The storm had arrived in full force, and we were trapped in its midst. Inside our tent, we held onto each other, our hearts pounding in sync with the thunderclaps. The wind howled mercilessly, and we could hear the creaking and groaning of the dead trees all around us. Every few minutes, a loud crack would pierce through the cacophony of the storm, the sound of branches snapping under the force of the wind. As night fell, the storm showed no signs of abating. The darkness outside was periodically illuminated by brilliant flashes of lightning, casting eerie shadows of the skeletal trees on our tent walls. Each flash was followed by a deafening boom of thunder that made us flinch involuntarily. Throughout this ordeal, a nagging thought kept returning to my mind: the other campsite across the lake. We hadn't seen anyone there all day, and even now, in the midst of this ferocious storm, there was no sign of activity. No flashlights, no voices calling out, nothing. It was as if the other tent had been abandoned long ago. Hours passed, feeling like an eternity. The relentless assault of wind and rain on our tent, combined with the constant fear of a falling tree, made sleep impossible. We lay awake, alert to every sound, every gust of wind that threatened to tear our shelter apart. Eventually, exhaustion began to overtake us, and we drifted into a fitful sleep as the storm gradually began to subside. However, our night of terror was far from over. I'm not sure how long we had been asleep when I was jolted awake by a strange sensation. It took me a moment to realize what had woken me. A beam of light was moving across the fabric of our tent. My heart leaped into my throat as I recognized the distinctive pattern of a flashlight beam. Someone was outside our tent, in the middle of the night, in this remote wilderness. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, as the light moved slowly around our tent. My girlfriend stirred beside me, and I gently squeezed her hand, silently willing her to remain quiet. The beam of light paused at the entrance of our tent, and I could see the faint silhouette of a figure through the fabric. In that moment, a primal fear took over. I shouted out, my voice hoarse and trembling, "Who's there?" The reaction was immediate. The light vanished, plunging us back into darkness. We heard the sound of rapid footsteps crunching on wet leaves, growing fainter as whoever it was retreated into the night. For the rest of the night, we remained awake, huddled together in our sleeping bags, straining our ears for any sound of the mysterious visitor's return. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig in the forest around us sent a fresh wave of fear through our bodies. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, each minute feeling like an hour. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we cautiously emerged from our tent. The aftermath of the storm was evident all around us. Broken branches littered the ground, and several of the dead trees had toppled over, their decaying roots unable to withstand the force of the wind. With trepidation, I turned my gaze towards the other campsite across the lake. In the gray light of early morning, it looked completely deserted. The tent was still there, but there was no sign of life, no movement, no smoke from a morning campfire, nothing. We quickly packed up our belongings, our hands shaking as we dismantled our tent and stuffed our gear into our backpacks. Neither of us spoke much. The events of the night had left us shaken and eager to return to civilization. As we hiked out of the wilderness, retracing our steps from the day before, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I would turn around abruptly, half expecting to see someone following us. But there was never anyone there, just the silent, indifferent forest. The memory of that night still haunts me to this day. The ferocity of the unexpected storm, the vulnerability we felt in our fragile tent surrounded by precarious dead trees, and the chilling encounter with the unknown flashlight bearer, it all comes back to me in vivid detail during quiet moments. I've often wondered about the other campsite. Who had set up that tent? Were they somehow connected to our nocturnal visitor? Or had they left before the storm, leaving their tent behind? These questions remain unanswered, adding to the unsettling nature of the experience. This incident served as a stark reminder of the unpredictable and sometimes frightening nature of the wilderness. While the great outdoors offers unparalleled beauty and the opportunity for adventure, it also demands respect and caution. Nature's power, as demonstrated by the sudden storm, is awe-inspiring and terrifying in equal measure. Moreover, the encounter with the mysterious figure underscored the vulnerability one can feel in remote areas. The very isolation that makes these places so appealing can also leave one exposed to potential threats, both natural and human. Despite the fear we experienced, this trip also reinforced the importance of preparation and adaptability in outdoor adventures. Our quick actions to secure our campsite before the storm likely prevented a worse outcome. And while the night was terrifying, we managed to keep our wits about us and make it through safely. In the years since this incident, I've continued to explore the wilderness, but always with a heightened sense of awareness and respect for the potential dangers. I've learned to be more thorough in checking weather forecasts, to always have a contingency plan, and to trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. The experience has become a story I share with fellow outdoor enthusiasts, not to discourage them from exploring, but to emphasize the importance of being prepared and vigilant. It serves as a reminder that even in the most beautiful places, unexpected challenges can arise, and how we respond to these challenges can make all the difference. As I reflect on that night by the lake, surrounded by dead trees and buffeted by a furious storm, I'm reminded of the dual nature of wilderness experiences. They can be sources of great joy and profound connection with nature, but they can also be crucibles that test our courage and resourcefulness. In the end, it's these challenges that often lead to the most growth and the most memorable adventures, even if they're not always the kind of memories we set out to make. It was the summer of 2003, and I had just turned 20. The world was a different place back then. Smartphones weren't ubiquitous, social media was in its infancy, and the echoes of the Blair Witch Project still reverberated through popular culture. That film had left an indelible mark on my psyche, coloring my perception of the great outdoors with a tinge of unease. Despite this lingering apprehension, I couldn't resist the call of nature. Arkansas, with its lush forests and winding rivers, beckoned to me. So, I gathered a few friends, packed our gear, and set off for a weekend of camping in the Ozark National Forest. We arrived at the campground late in the afternoon. The sun was already beginning its descent, casting long shadows through the towering pines. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. As we set up our tents, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I chalked it up to my overactive imagination, still influenced by that unsettling found footage film. Our campsite was relatively isolated, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. We could hear the faint sound of a stream in the distance, its gentle burbling a soothing counterpoint to the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As night fell, we gathered around our campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the trees, and every now and then, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye. Each time, it turned out to be nothing more than a moth or a falling leaf. As the night wore on, my friends began to retire to their tents. I lingered by the dying embers of the fire, watching as the last flames sputtered and died. The forest seemed to come alive in the darkness, filled with the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I finally decided to turn in, zipping myself into my tent and nestling into my sleeping bag. Sleep came fitfully. The unfamiliar sounds of the forest kept startling me awake. Each time I drifted off, I'd jerk awake at the snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves. The rational part of my brain knew these were just the normal sounds of the woods at night, but the part of me that still remembered every frame of the Blair Witch Project couldn't help but imagine sinister forces at work in the darkness. It must have been around 2 or 3 in the morning when I was jolted awake by a sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought I was dreaming. It sounded like crying. Not the mournful howl of some wild animal, but the distinctive wail of a human child. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. There it was again, definitely crying, and it seemed to be moving around our campsite. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of bizarre prank or a vivid nightmare. I pinched myself hard, hoping to wake up. The pain was sharp and real, and the crying continued. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Small hands were patting against the side of my tent, accompanied by sniffling and what sounded like a child trying to form words. My mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was this some kind of supernatural entity, luring us out of the safety of our tents? Was it a lost child, somehow wandering alone in the wilderness in the middle of the night? Or was it something even worse, a trap set by someone with malicious intent? I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with indecision. The crying continued, punctuated by the sound of small feet shuffling around the campsite. I could hear my friends stirring in their tents, whispering urgently to each other. Finally, I knew I had to do something. Whatever was out there, I couldn't just ignore it. With trembling hands, I unzipped my tent, my imagination conjuring all manner of horrors that might be waiting for me. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, and there, standing not 3 feet from my tent, was a small child. He couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 years old, wearing nothing but a diaper. His face was streaked with tears and dirt, his little chest heaving with sobs. For a moment, I just stared, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This was simultaneously better and worse than anything I had imagined. There was no supernatural monster, no sinister trap, just a lost, frightened toddler. But the reality of the situation quickly set in, bringing with it a whole new set of fears and questions. How had this child gotten here? Where were his parents? And what on earth was I supposed to do now? I stepped out of the tent, my friends emerging from theirs as well. We all stood there, a group of bewildered 20-somethings facing a situation none of us were prepared for. The child looked up at us with wide, tear-filled eyes, his lower lip trembling. Instinctively, I knelt down to his level, speaking in what I hoped was a soothing tone. "Hey there, little guy. Are you lost?" The child nodded, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. Without thinking, I opened my arms, and he ran into them, clinging to me like a lifeline. As I stood up, holding the child, the full weight of our predicament hit me. We were miles from the nearest town, in a campground with no cell phone reception. The ranger station was closed for the night. We had no way to contact authorities, and even if we did, how would we explain our situation? My friends and I huddled together, speaking in hushed tones to avoid frightening the child further. We debated our options, each seeming more problematic than the last. We couldn't go door to door in the campground, most of the other campers were likely asleep, and the idea of strangers approaching tents in the middle of the night with a child that wasn't theirs seemed like a recipe for disaster. We finally decided that calling the police was our safest bet. One of us would have to hike to the ranger station and use the emergency phone there. It wasn't an ideal solution, but it seemed like the most responsible course of action. Just as we were deciding who would make the trek, we heard footsteps on the trail leading to our campsite. A figure emerged from the darkness, a woman, looking disheveled and frantic. The moment she saw us, relief flooded her features. "Oh, thank goodness," she exclaimed, rushing towards us. "How did you get out, sweetie?" The child in my arms immediately perked up, calling out, "Mama." He squirmed in my grasp, reaching for the woman. I hesitated for a moment, a part of me reluctant to hand over the child without some kind of explanation or verification. But the woman's relief seemed genuine, and the child's reaction left little doubt that this was indeed his mother. As I passed the toddler to her, she smiled at us tiredly. "Thank you so much," she said, her tone surprisingly calm given the circumstances. "He's been figuring out how to unzip the tent. I thought I had it secured, but—" She trailed off, shrugging as if to say, "Kids, what can you do?" And then, as abruptly as they had entered our night, the woman and child were gone, heading back down the trail towards their own campsite. We stood there in stunned silence for a few moments, trying to process what had just happened. As the adrenaline began to wear off, we found ourselves laughing, a slightly hysterical release of tension. We spent the rest of the night around the rekindled campfire, too wired to sleep, dissecting every moment of our bizarre encounter. In the light of day, the events of the previous night took on an almost dreamlike quality. If it hadn't been for the muddy footprints around our tents and the lingering sense of shared experience among my friends, I might have been tempted to dismiss it all as a particularly vivid nightmare. As we packed up our campsite that morning, I found myself reflecting on the experience. At the time, it had been terrifying and confusing. But now, years later, as a parent myself, I see it through different eyes. I imagine that mother's panic when she realized her child was missing, her frantic search through the dark woods. I think about how easily a curious toddler can slip away in an instant, turning a peaceful family camping trip into a nightmare scenario. That night in the Arkansas woods taught me valuable lessons about the unpredictability of life, the importance of keeping a cool head in crisis situations, and the profound responsibility that comes with caring for a child. It's a story I've told many times over the years, each retelling bringing new insights as my own life experiences color my perspective. And every time I go camping now, with my own family, I double-check the tent zippers before turning in for the night. Just in case. It was a crisp autumn evening when my wife and I decided to embark on a camping trip, seeking respite from our hectic urban lives. We had been planning this getaway for weeks, carefully selecting a remote location nestled deep within the heart of the national forest. The drive to our chosen campsite was long but scenic, winding through dense woods and alongside babbling streams. As we arrived at our destination, the sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. We quickly set about pitching our tent, a sturdy four-season model we had invested in for occasions just like this. The air was filled with the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil, a refreshing change from the city's pollution. Once our temporary home was erected, we gathered firewood and kindling from the surrounding area, being careful to only collect fallen branches as per the park regulations. I prided myself on my fire-starting skills, and soon we had a cheerful blaze crackling before us, its warm glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. We sat around the campfire, our faces illuminated by the dancing flames. My wife and I engaged in pleasant conversation, discussing our plans for the coming days, hikes we wanted to take, landmarks we hoped to see. It was a rare moment of peace and connection, away from the constant notifications and demands of our everyday lives. As we talked, we shared a simple but satisfying meal: campfire roasted potatoes and grilled sausages, savoring the smoky flavor that only outdoor cooking can provide. The night air was cool but not uncomfortably so, and we were content in our little bubble of warmth and light. Suddenly, without warning, the weather took a dramatic turn. The skies opened up, and rain began to pour down with an intensity that caught us both off guard. We scrambled to save our food and supplies, quickly retreating to the safety of our tent. The downpour was so heavy that it drowned out all other sounds, creating a constant, almost deafening pitter-patter as countless droplets struck the canvas above our heads. Realizing that our evening by the fire had come to an abrupt end, we decided to make the best of the situation. We changed into dry clothes, our movements awkward in the confined space of the tent. The rain showed no signs of letting up, so we resigned ourselves to calling it an early night. We slipped into our sleeping bags, the soft rustle of nylon against nylon barely audible over the relentless rain. I reached out to turn off our battery-powered lantern, plunging the tent into darkness. The rain continued its assault, creating an oddly soothing white noise that I thought might lull us to sleep. But then, piercing through the monotonous sound of rainfall, we heard something else. It was a strange, electronic-sounding noise, a sort of bleep-bleep that reminded me of the low battery warning on an old Motorola phone. My wife and I exchanged puzzled glances in the darkness, both of us instantly alert. The sound was unsettling for several reasons. Firstly, we didn't own any devices that made such a noise. Secondly, we had turned off our phones to conserve battery life and fully disconnect from the world. And most importantly, we were miles from the nearest campsite or road. Who or what could be making that sound out here, in the middle of nowhere, in this downpour? We lay perfectly still, straining our ears. The rain made it impossible to discern if anyone was approaching our tent. The realization that we were effectively trapped in this canvas shelter, with only one exit, began to sink in. A creeping sense of vulnerability washed over us. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as we remained frozen in place, barely daring to breathe. My mind raced through possible explanations and potential courses of action. Was it an animal? Another camper who had gotten lost? Or was it something more sinister? Eventually, the tension became unbearable. I knew I had to do something. if only to put our minds at ease. I whispered to my wife that I was going to check outside. She nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and concern. With trembling hands, I reached for the small handgun I had brought for protection against wildlife. I never thought I'd actually need to use it, but in that moment, I was grateful for its reassuring weight. I also grabbed our flashlight, its beam a pitiful defense against the unknown darkness outside. Taking a deep breath, I made a dash for the tent's entrance. I unzipped it as quickly as I could, half expecting to come face to face with some nightmarish figure. Instead, I was greeted by a wall of rain and impenetrable darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. Ignoring the rain soaking through my clothes, I circled our tent, sweeping the area with the flashlight beam. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. But there was nothing. No sign of anyone or anything that could have made the strange noise. The surrounding forest was still, save for the constant drumming of rain on leaves. I returned to the tent, soaked to the bone and shivering, but somewhat relieved. I reported my findings, or lack thereof, to my wife. However, the unsettling experience had shaken us both. The thought of spending the rest of the night in this isolated spot, wondering if the mysterious noise would return, was too much to bear. We made a quick decision to abandon our campsite. Hastily, we gathered our most valuable possessions, wallets, phones, car keys, and prepared to make a break for it. The walk to our car, which we had left at a small parking area about 10 minutes away, now seemed like a daunting journey. With me leading the way, flashlight in one hand and gun in the other, we set out into the rainy night. The forest path, which had seemed so inviting during the day, now felt treacherous and foreboding. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves made us jump. The rain continued unabated, reducing visibility and turning the ground into a slippery mess. After what felt like an eternity, we finally reached our car. We practically dove inside, locking the doors immediately. Only then did we allow ourselves to breathe a sigh of relief. The familiar interior of our vehicle felt like a sanctuary after the unsettling events at the campsite. We sat there for a few moments, water dripping from our clothes onto the seats, as we debated what to do next. The sensible thing would have been to inform the park rangers about our experience. However, the thought of staying in the area any longer than necessary was unappealing. In the end, we decided to drive home, a journey of about an hour. The drive was tense and quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts about what had transpired. We arrived home in the early hours of the morning, exhausted but grateful for the safety and comfort of our apartment. After a few hours of fitful sleep, we woke to find the sun shining brightly, as if mocking the terror of the previous night. In the light of day, our fears seemed somewhat overblown. We began to rationalize the experience. Perhaps it was just an animal, or maybe our tired minds had played tricks on us. Regardless, we knew we had to return to the campsite to retrieve the rest of our belongings. So, after a hearty breakfast and several cups of strong coffee, we set out once again for the forest. The drive back was surreal. The same road that had seemed so ominous in the dark now appeared picturesque and inviting. We arrived at the parking area and made the short hike to our campsite, half expecting to find it ransacked or disturbed in some way. To our surprise, everything was exactly as we had left it. Our tent stood undisturbed, our remaining possessions inside untouched. There were no footprints in the mud around the campsite, no signs that anyone or anything had been there in our absence. We packed up our gear efficiently, eager to put this place behind us. As we worked, we discussed the events of the night before, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had we overreacted? Was there a logical explanation for the strange noise we'd heard? It wasn't until we got home and began unpacking that we discovered something truly unsettling. As my wife sorted through her belongings, she realized that all of her underwear was missing. Not a single pair remained among her clothes. We were dumbfounded. We double-checked all our bags, searched the car, and even called the campground office to see if anything had been turned in. Nothing. The underwear had simply vanished. This discovery sent a chill down our spines. It proved that our experience hadn't been a mere figment of our imaginations. Someone had indeed been at our campsite that night, someone who had managed to enter our tent and remove specific items without disturbing anything else. The implications were terrifying. Who was this person? How long had they been watching us? What were their intentions? And most disturbingly, what might have happened if we hadn't left when we did? In the days that followed, we reported the incident to both the park rangers and the local police. They took our statement seriously but admitted that without more evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They promised to increase patrols in the area and advised other campers to be cautious. The experience left a lasting impact on us. We found ourselves jumpy and paranoid for weeks afterward, startling at small noises and double-checking the locks on our doors and windows. Our enthusiasm for camping waned significantly, and it would be a long time before we felt comfortable sleeping in a tent again. Looking back on that night, I'm grateful that we trusted our instincts and left when we did. The thought of what might have happened had we stayed still sends shivers down my spine. It serves as a stark reminder that even in seemingly peaceful and isolated places, danger can lurk. We never did get a satisfactory explanation for what happened that night. The mysterious noise, the missing underwear, it all remains a disturbing puzzle. But one thing is certain, our perception of safety in the great outdoors has been forever altered. We learned the hard way that sometimes, the most unsettling threats are the ones we can't see, hiding just beyond the reach of our flashlight beams, waiting in the darkness. In the weeks that followed, we found ourselves constantly replaying the events of that night in our minds, searching for any detail we might have missed. We scoured local news reports, hoping to find similar incidents that might shed light on our experience. But there was nothing. The incident had a profound effect on our relationship as well. On one hand, it brought us closer together, having shared such an intense and frightening experience. We found ourselves more appreciative of each other, more aware of the fragility of our safety and peace of mind. On the other hand, it introduced a new element of tension. We became more protective of each other, sometimes to the point of being overbearing. Our friends and family noticed the change in us. We were more reserved, less likely to venture out for social gatherings, especially after dark. When we did share our story, we were met with a mix of concern, skepticism, and morbid curiosity. Some suggested we might have imagined it all, a product of overactive imaginations fueled by too many horror movies. Others urged us to pursue the matter further, convinced that there must be more to the story. Driven by a need for closure, we decided to do some investigating of our own. We reached out to other campers who had stayed in the same area around the time of our incident. Most had uneventful stays, but a few reported strange occurrences, unexplained noises, items going missing, an unsettling feeling of being watched. While none of these accounts matched the severity of our experience, they suggested that we weren't alone in our unease. We also delved into the history of the area, wondering if there might be some local legend or past event that could explain what had happened. We uncovered stories of an old hermit who had once lived in those woods, a man who had retreated from society after suffering some unnamed trauma. Some locals claimed he still roamed the forest, harmless but eccentric. Others spoke of more sinister figures, poachers who operated in the area, or criminals who used the remote location to hide from the law. As time passed, the intensity of our fear began to fade, replaced by a deep-seated caution and a newfound respect for the unpredictability of nature, both human and wild. We started to venture out again, but our approach to outdoor activities had changed dramatically. We invested in high-tech security devices for camping, motion sensors, wireless cameras, personal alarms. Our preparations became almost militaristic in their thoroughness. Slowly, we began to reclaim our love for the outdoors. Our first camping trip after the incident was a nerve-wracking experience. We chose a popular, well-patrolled campground, far from the site of our previous adventure. We barely slept that first night, jumping at every sound. But as the sun rose the next morning, we felt a sense of victory. We had faced our fears and survived. Over time, we expanded our comfort zone, gradually venturing into more remote areas. Each successful trip helped to rebuild our confidence. We even considered returning to the site of our fateful night, a sort of pilgrimage to confront our lingering fears. In the end, we decided against it. Some memories, we felt, were better left undisturbed. The incident changed us in ways we never expected. We became more aware of our surroundings, more attuned to the subtle signs of danger that we might have previously ignored. This heightened awareness extended beyond our outdoor adventures into our daily lives. We found ourselves more cautious in urban settings as well, more conscious of the potential threats that lurk in even the most familiar environments. Our experience also sparked a passion for advocacy. We became involved in camping safety initiatives, sharing our story as a cautionary tale and working to promote better security measures in national parks and forests. We connected with other survivors of similar incidents, finding solace and strength in shared experiences. As the years passed, the memory of that night remained vivid, but its power over us diminished. We came to see it not just as a traumatic event, but as a pivotal moment that had reshaped our lives in both challenging and ultimately positive ways. It had tested our resilience, strengthened our bond, and given us a new perspective on life. Looking back now, I realized that the true horror of that night wasn't just the unknown threat we faced, but the sudden shattering of our sense of security. We had ventured into nature seeking peace and connection, only to be confronted with the harsh reality that danger can find us anywhere. Yet in facing that danger, in choosing to confront our fears rather than be ruled by them, we discovered a strength we didn't know we possessed. The mystery of what really happened that night in the forest remains unsolved. Perhaps it will always be so. But in a way, the lack of resolution has become a part of our story, a reminder that life is full of uncertainties and that true courage lies in how we face them. As I sit here, years removed from that rainy night in the forest, I can't help but feel a mix of emotions. There's still a flicker of fear when I recall the sound that pierced the darkness, still a chill when I think of the missing items we discovered. But there's also a sense of pride in how we've grown from the experience, how we've refused to let fear dictate our lives. Our camping gear still sits in our garage, well maintained and ready for the next adventure. And while we may approach the wilderness with more caution now, we haven't lost our love for its beauty and serenity. If anything, our appreciation has deepened, tempered by the knowledge of both its wonders and its dangers. In the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson we learned from our unsettling encounter in the forest. Life, like nature, is full of unknowns. We can't always control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond. And sometimes, it's in facing our deepest fears that we discover our greatest strengths. As night falls and I hear the distant call of wilderness through our open window, I no longer feel just fear. Instead, I feel a complex mixture of respect, caution, and an enduring sense of wonder. The forest may hide its secrets, but it also holds the promise of discovery, of connection, of adventures yet to come. And armed with the wisdom of our experience, we're ready to embrace whatever lies ahead, in the wilderness and in life. It was late summer last year when I decided to go camping with two of my closest friends in British Columbia. We chose a popular campsite, hoping for a relaxing evening surrounded by nature. Little did we know that this ordinary camping trip would turn into the most terrifying experience of our lives. The day started off perfectly. We arrived at the campsite in the early afternoon, the sun still high in the sky, casting warm rays through the dense foliage of the surrounding forest. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. We set up our tent, unrolled our sleeping bags, and organized our gear, all while chatting excitedly about the night ahead. As we worked, I couldn't help but appreciate the beauty of our surroundings. The campsite was nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by towering evergreens that seemed to touch the sky. A gentle breeze rustled through the leaves, creating a soothing melody that complemented the distant sound of a rushing river. It was the perfect backdrop for what we hoped would be a memorable weekend getaway. Once our camp was set up, we decided to explore the area a bit. We followed a well-worn trail that led down to the river we had heard earlier. The water was crystal clear, flowing swiftly over smooth, multicolored pebbles. We spent some time skipping stones across the surface, competing to see who could get the most skips. The simple activity brought back fond memories of childhood camping trips, and we found ourselves sharing stories of past adventures in the great outdoors. As we made our way back to the campsite, we gathered firewood for the evening. The forest floor was littered with dry branches and twigs, perfect for starting a fire. We each took turns carrying armfuls of wood, joking about who could carry the most. It was during this task that we first noticed how quiet the forest seemed. Besides the occasional bird call or the rustling of leaves, there was an unusual stillness that we couldn't quite put our finger on. At the time, we brushed it off as nothing more than the peaceful tranquility of nature. Back at the campsite, we set about starting a fire. One of my friends was particularly skilled at this, having learned from his father, who was an avid outdoorsman. He carefully arranged the kindling and smaller twigs, then used a flint and steel to create a spark. Within minutes, we had a small but strong fire going. The crackling flames cast a warm glow around our site, creating a cozy atmosphere that instantly made us feel at home in the wilderness. As evening approached, we prepared our meal. We had brought along a portable camping stove, but decided to cook over the open fire for a more authentic experience. Our menu was simple but delicious: grilled vegetables and sausages, their aroma mixing with the wood smoke to create a mouth-watering scent that made our stomachs growl in anticipation. While the food cooked, we sat around the fire, sharing stories and catching up on each other's lives. It had been a while since we had all been together like this, free from the distractions of work and daily responsibilities. There was something about being in nature that seemed to strip away the layers of stress and worry, allowing us to connect on a deeper level. As we ate our meal, we couldn't help but marvel at how much better food tastes when cooked outdoors. The smoky flavor of the fire infused every bite, and we savored each mouthful, washing it down with cold beers we had brought along in a cooler. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and moments of comfortable silence as we gazed into the flames. After dinner, we opened a bottle of wine we had brought along for the occasion. The rich red liquid sparkled in the firelight as we poured it into our camping mugs. We toasted to friendship and adventure, completely unaware of what the night had in store for us. The wine added to the warmth of the fire and the good company, creating a perfect sense of contentment. Hours passed as we sat around the fire, sharing more stories, laughing, and enjoying each other's company. We talked about our hopes and dreams, our fears and insecurities. There's something about being in nature, away from the distractions of everyday life, that encourages deeper, more meaningful conversations. We discussed our careers, our relationships, and our plans for the future. It was one of those perfect moments of camaraderie that make camping trips so special. As the night wore on, the campsite around us grew quiet. Other campers retired to their tents, and the sounds of nature took over: the gentle rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft gurgle of the nearby river. We were probably the only ones still awake, our voices now hushed as we continued our conversation under the star-studded sky. The night sky was a spectacle in itself. Away from the light pollution of the city, the stars shone with an intensity one had almost forgotten existed. We lay back on the ground, pointing at constellations and watching for shooting stars. The vastness of the universe above us put our own lives into perspective, making our worries seem small in comparison. It was during this peaceful stargazing that we first noticed something odd. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, suddenly fell silent. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, turning off all the ambient noise we had grown accustomed to. The silence was eerie and unnatural, sending a shiver down my spine despite the warmth of the fire. We sat up, looking at each other with confused expressions. One of my friends whispered, "Do you hear that?" But of course, there was nothing to hear. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackling of our fire and the sound of our own breathing. For a few minutes, we sat in tense silence, straining our ears for any sound. Gradually, the normal nighttime noises resumed. A owl hooted in the distance, leaves rustled in the breeze. We laughed nervously, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over us. We chalked it up to our imaginations running wild in the dark forest. To lighten the mood, we decided to tell ghost stories. It seemed fitting, given the atmosphere of the dark forest around us. We each took turns, trying to outdo each other with tales of haunted houses, vengeful spirits, and mysterious creatures lurking in the shadows. As we spoke, our voices hushed and dramatic, the forest seemed to press in around us, the darkness beyond our firelight growing deeper and more menacing. It was around 1 a.m. when everything changed. The peaceful night was suddenly shattered by a sound that sent chills down our spines. At first, it was distant, a faint thumping that could have been easily dismissed as our imagination. But within seconds, it grew louder, more insistent. It was unmistakably the sound of something large running towards us. The ground beneath us began to vibrate with each thunderous step. My heart raced, and I felt a primal fear unlike anything I had ever experienced before. I looked at my friends, their faces pale in the dying firelight, and I knew they felt the same overwhelming dread. Our first thought was that it must be a person, perhaps a fellow camper or ranger. But as the footsteps grew closer, we realized that no human could make the earth shake like that. Whatever was charging towards us was massive, far larger than any man. The darkness beyond our campfire's glow seemed to deepen, as if the very night was conspiring to hide this terrifying entity from our sight. We strained our eyes, trying to catch a glimpse of what was approaching, but the contrast between our lit area and the pitch-black forest made it impossible to see anything. In those few seconds, which felt like an eternity, a million thoughts raced through my mind. Was it a bear? A moose? Or something we couldn't even imagine? The fear of the unknown amplified our terror tenfold. I found myself wishing for it to be a bear, as terrifying as that would be, because at least that was something I could understand, something that belonged in this world. The sound grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right upon us. The ground shook with each step, and I could hear the snapping of branches and the rustling of leaves as whatever it was plowed through the underbrush. The fire, which had been our source of comfort all evening, now felt pathetically small and inadequate in the face of this unseen threat. Just as we thought the creature would burst into our campsite, we heard an enormous splash. Whatever it was had charged straight into the river beside our site. The sound of rushing water mixed with the thrashing of a large body, creating a cacophony that broke the spell of terror that had frozen us in place. Snapping out of our paralysis, we scrambled to our feet and ran towards our car. Hands shaking, I fumbled with the keys before managing to unlock the doors. We piled in, locking ourselves inside the relative safety of the vehicle. Our breaths came in short, panic gasps as we peered out of the windows, trying to catch a glimpse of what had nearly run us down. For what felt like hours, we sat in the car, too afraid to move or speak above a whisper. We debated what it could have been, with a bear being the most logical explanation. But even as we said it aloud, none of us truly believed it. The feeling of absolute terror we had experienced seemed too intense, too otherworldly to have been caused by any ordinary animal. As we sat there, huddled together in the confines of the car, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We replayed the events in our minds, trying to remember any detail that might shed light on the nature of our unseen visitor. Had there been any unusual signs earlier in the day that we had overlooked? Had other campers mentioned anything strange? One of my friends suggested that perhaps it had been a prank, someone trying to scare campers for fun. But we quickly dismissed this idea. The footsteps we had heard were far too heavy, too powerful to have been made by a person, even someone wearing some kind of stilts or costume. As the adrenaline began to wear off, exhaustion set in. We were physically and emotionally drained from the experience. Despite our fear, we found ourselves drifting off to sleep in the cramped confines of the car, taking turns to stay awake and keep watch. As the first light of dawn began to break, we cautiously emerged from the car. The forest looked different in the pale morning light, less threatening, but somehow changed. It was as if the events of the night had stripped away the innocence of our surroundings, revealing a wilder, more unpredictable nature beneath the surface. We packed up our campsite in record time, constantly looking over our shoulders, jumping at every sound. The cheerful atmosphere of the previous day was gone, replaced by a tense silence broken only by the occasional whispered instruction or question. Before leaving, we examined the area around the river, looking for tracks or any sign of what had passed through. To our surprise and confusion, we found nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, no evidence at all of the massive creature that had terrified us so thoroughly. The lack of physical evidence was almost as unsettling as the experience itself. It made us question our own memories, our own senses. As we searched, we noticed other campers emerging from their tents, going about their morning routines as if nothing had happened. We approached a few, asking if they had heard anything unusual during the night. To our astonishment, no one else seemed to have noticed anything out of the ordinary. They spoke of a peaceful night's sleep, undisturbed by any strange noises or earth-shaking footsteps. Their obliviousness to our terrifying experience added another layer of confusion and doubt to our already shaken minds. How could something so massive, so earth-shaking, have gone unnoticed by everyone else in the campsite? It didn't make sense, and yet we couldn't deny what we had experienced. On the drive home, we tried to rationalize what had happened. We discussed all the possibilities: a bear, a moose, even the far-fetched idea of a Sasquatch. But none of our explanations seemed to fully capture the intensity of what we had experienced. The more we talked about it, the more surreal it seemed, like a shared nightmare that had somehow bled into reality. The days and weeks following our camping trip were filled with a mixture of fear, confusion, and an insatiable curiosity to understand what had happened. We scoured the internet for similar stories, reaching out to cryptozoology forums and local folklore groups. We found plenty of tales of strange encounters in the wilderness, but nothing that quite matched our experience. We even contacted the park rangers, hoping they might have some insight into what we had encountered. They listened to our story politely but seemed skeptical. They assured us that while bears and other large wildlife were common in the area, there had never been any reports of anything matching the size and behavior of what we had experienced. Despite the lack of corroborating evidence or similar reports, none of us could shake the conviction that what we had experienced was real. The terror we had felt that night was too visceral, too intense to have been a product of our imaginations or a simple misunderstanding of natural phenomena. In the months that followed, our camping trip became a topic of endless discussion and speculation among our group of friends. Some were fascinated by our story, eager to hear every detail and offer their own theories. Others were skeptical, gently suggesting that perhaps our fears had gotten the better of us in the dark of night. The experience changed us in subtle ways. We found ourselves more aware of our surroundings, more attuned to the sounds of nature. Walks in the woods, once a source of peace and relaxation, now carried an undercurrent of tension, a heightened alertness to every snapping twig or rustling leaf. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, we found ourselves drawn back to the outdoors. We went on more camping trips, each time half hoping and half fearing that we might encounter something similar. But nothing ever came close to matching the intensity of that night. To this day, whenever we get together, the conversation inevitably turns to that night. We've researched local wildlife, spoken to park rangers, and even reached out to other campers who might have had similar experiences. But we've never found a satisfactory explanation for what happened. That camping trip remains the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. It's a reminder of how quickly a peaceful moment in nature can turn into something terrifying and unexplainable. While I still enjoy camping and outdoor activities, I've never been able to shake off the feeling that something out there in the wilderness defies our understanding. The experience has left me with a profound respect for the mysteries of the natural world. It's made me realize that despite all our knowledge and technology, there are still things out there that we can't explain, forces of nature that we can't control or fully comprehend. And on quiet nights, when the wind rustles through the trees, I sometimes find myself listening intently, half expecting to hear those thunderous footsteps once again. The memory of that night serves as a constant reminder that the world is a far stranger and more mysterious place than we often give it credit for.